The imposing chambers of the Senate Banking Committee crackled with electric tension as America's most arrogant Treasury Secretary prepared to face the one senator who had never lost a financial policy battle. Scott Bessent sat at the witness table with insufferable smugness, his $5,000 Italian suit and Rolex Submariner screaming Wall Street arrogance as he prepared to lecture elected officials about economics like they were first-year business students who couldn't understand his superior intellect and sophisticated financial theories. "Let me educate this committee about real economic policy," Bessent declared with breathtaking condescension, his voice dripping with Ivy League superiority as he surveyed the senators like a professor addressing particularly slow students. "Unlike the simplistic political theater you're used to, actual financial management requires advanced mathematical models and complex theoretical frameworks that frankly exceed the intellectual capacity of most elected officials. My strategies utilize cutting-edge econometric analysis that represents decades of Wall Street innovation beyond anything you've encountered in your provincial political careers." The packed hearing room buzzed with shocked murmurs as financial reporters and banking lobbyists absorbed Bessent's unprecedented display of contempt for congressional oversight. His communications team looked horrified as their boss systematically insulted every senator on the committee while positioning himself as intellectually superior to the entire legislative branch. Treasury Secretary Bessent had built his reputation on managing billions for ultra-wealthy clients who paid obscene fees for his supposedly genius-level financial strategies, and his arrogance reflected decades of being told he was smarter than everyone else in every room he entered. His Yale MBA and 20-year hedge fund career had convinced him that government officials were intellectual inferiors who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated complexities of modern finance. "Your questions about inflation and economic policy demonstrate exactly the kind of amateur-hour thinking that has plagued this committee for years," Bessent continued, his condescension reaching breathtaking levels as he openly mocked senators who dared to question his policies. "Perhaps if you had actually studied economics at prestigious institutions rather than whatever backwater colleges produced your limited understanding, you might appreciate the nuanced brilliance of my approach to monetary policy and financial regulation." The insult was so brazen and offensive that several committee members exchanged shocked glances, while Democratic senators who typically defended Biden administration officials looked embarrassed by their Treasury Secretary's spectacular display of elitist contempt for democratic accountability. But Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana sat quietly reviewing a folder that contained the most devastating financial documentation ever assembled against a Treasury Secretary, his calm demeanor masking volcanic anger at watching this Wall Street parasite lecture hard-working senators like they were idiots. Kennedy had spent months investigating Bessent's background and had uncovered corruption, incompetence, and personal enrichment that would destroy not just his career but potentially land him in federal prison. Kennedy's wire-rimmed glasses reflected the hearing room lights as he methodically reviewed Federal Reserve data, Treasury Department internal communications, and financial disclosure documents that revealed Bessent as a corrupt fraud whose sophisticated theories were cover for systematic theft from American taxpayers while enriching himself and his Wall Street cronies. "I suppose you're all wondering why a real economist would waste time explaining advanced concepts to politicians whose economic expertise comes from reading donor talking points rather than peer-reviewed academic research," Bessent sneered, his arrogance now reaching levels that made even his Democratic allies cringe with embarrassment. "But since the American people deserve competent economic leadership rather than the political amateur hour that typically characterizes congressional oversight, I'll attempt to educate you about how actual professionals manage complex financial systems." The insult was so outrageous that Senator Kennedy slowly stood up from his chair, his movement immediately commanding the attention of every person in the chamber as the most dangerous questioner in congressional history prepared to systematically destroy the most arrogant witness who had ever appeared before the Banking Committee. "Well now, Secretary Bessent," Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl cutting through Bessent's academic pretension like a chainsaw through silk, his voice carrying deadly calm that made experienced politicians recognize they were about to witness political annihilation. "I've been sitting here listening to you lecture this committee about our limited intellectual capacity and amateur-hour thinking, and I have to say, your confidence is just remarkable. But since you've decided to educate us ignorant senators about sophisticated economics, maybe you can help me understand some basic math about your brilliant financial management." Bessent's smug expression flickered as he realized his condescending lecture had just triggered the most feared congressional interrogator in American history, but his Wall Street arrogance prevented him from recognizing the mortal danger he had just created for himself. "Senator Kennedy," Bessent replied with continued condescension, his tone suggesting he was about to explain economics to a particularly slow child, "I'd be happy to simplify complex economic concepts for your understanding, though I suspect the mathematical sophistication required for modern financial policy might challenge someone whose economic education apparently stopped at whatever community college produced your primitive grasp of monetary theory." The insult was so spectacularly stupid and offensive that Kennedy's eyes lit up with the predatory gleam that preceded the complete destruction of political careers through systematic documentary evidence. "Oh, Secretary Bessent," Kennedy said with terrifying calm, reaching into his folder to withdraw a thick stack of federal documents, "I appreciate your concern about my community college education, though I suspect Harvard Law School might disagree with your assessment. But since you've volunteered to demonstrate your mathematical sophistication, let's examine some numbers about your brilliant economic leadership." Kennedy held up official Treasury Department reports with theatrical precision, his movement commanding absolute silence as every person in the chamber recognized they were about to witness the systematic destruction of the most arrogant government official in modern history. "According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which I assume your Yale MBA taught you to read," Kennedy began with devastating sarcasm, "real wages for American workers have collapsed 4.7% during your 10 months as Treasury Secretary, while grocery costs have exploded 23% and gasoline has increased 31%. That means working families are paying dramatically more for basic necessities while earning significantly less money. Now, I may just have a community college education, but it seems to me like your sophisticated strategies are systematically destroying the financial security of ordinary Americans. How exactly does impoverishing working families while lecturing Congress about our intellectual inferiority demonstrate your mathematical brilliance?" Napalm, immediately exposing his sophisticated theories as catastrophic failures that were causing real suffering for millions of American families while he insulted the senators trying to hold him accountable. Furthermore, Kennedy continued with building fury. "According to Federal Reserve data on small business lending, credit availability for Main Street companies has been slaughtered by 38% under your genius economic policies, while Wall Street investment banks have gorged themselves on $1.2 trillion in federal liquidity programs that you personally designed. It appears your sophisticated mathematical models are incredibly effective at enriching your former Wall Street buddies while systematically destroying small businesses across America. Is that what they taught you at Yale about public service, or is that what you learned on Wall Street about using government positions to reward your criminal friends?" Bessent tried desperately to regain control as Kennedy systematically dismantled his credibility with federal data that exposed his policies as disasters for ordinary Americans. "Senator, those indicators require sophisticated contextual analysis that." "Sophisticated contextual analysis?" Kennedy exploded with righteous fury that made the entire chamber flinch. "Secretary Bessent, let me give you some context that your Yale education apparently missed. According to Treasury Department internal communications that this committee obtained through subpoena, you and your staff refer to struggling American families as expendable economic variables and small business owners as legacy market inefficiencies that need to be optimized through systematic elimination. Is that how your prestigious education taught you to think about the American people you swore to serve, you arrogant piece of Wall Street garbage?" The revelation that Bessent's Treasury Department used dehumanizing language to describe suffering Americans was so explosive that Democratic senators visibly recoiled in horror while Republicans leaned forward to hear Kennedy destroy this elitist monster. Kennedy wasn't finished obliterating Bessent's career. "And since you've been so helpful in educating us about mathematical sophistication, let's examine some numbers about your personal financial situation. According to your own financial disclosure forms, which I have right here, you maintained active investments in 17 hedge funds and 6 private equity firms when you took office, including $420 million in funds that have directly profited from every single Treasury policy you've implemented. Your sophisticated economic strategies have increased your personal wealth by $127 million since you became Treasury Secretary, while American families have lost over $8,000 in purchasing power. You've literally stolen from working families to enrich yourself, you corrupt Wall Street criminal. Bessent's face went completely white as Kennedy revealed that the Treasury Secretary had been personally profiting from policies that devastated ordinary Americans, creating massive conflicts of interest that could result in federal prosecution for corruption and fraud. Senator Kennedy, Bessent stammered, his arrogance finally cracking under Kennedy's systematic documentary assault. Those investments were properly managed through legal structures. Legal structures? Kennedy roared with moral outrage that shook the chamber walls. Secretary Bessent, according to the Office of Government Ethics Analysis that this committee requested, your so-called blind trusts were specifically designed to maximize your personal profits from Treasury policies while providing legal cover for systematic theft from American taxpayers. You've used your government position to steal $127 million from the very families you're supposed to protect while lecturing Congress about our intellectual inferiority. That's not sophisticated economics, that's criminal fraud disguised as public service. The systematic exposure of Bessent's corruption was so devastating that his legal team was frantically texting federal prosecutors while his communications staff prepared resignation statements. Kennedy gathered his papers with the ceremony of a judge delivering a death sentence. Secretary Bessent, you came here today and insulted every member of this committee, questioned our intelligence, mocked our education, and suggested we were too stupid to understand your brilliant strategies. But the numbers don't lie, and they show that you're nothing but a corrupt Wall Street parasite who has systematically stolen from American families while enriching yourself and your criminal associates. Your economic policies have been an unmitigated disaster for every working American while making you personally wealthy beyond measure. Kennedy's voice rose to thunderous moral authority that made the chamber vibrate with righteous fury. The American people don't need Treasury secretaries who lecture Congress about intellectual sophistication while stealing their money and destroying their economic futures. They need public servants who understand that real economics means helping ordinary families rather than using government positions to conduct criminal enterprises that benefit Wall Street thieves at the expense of hardworking Americans who trust their government to serve their interests rather than enrich corrupt elitists who view public service as a criminal opportunity. The hearing room erupted in chaos as Kennedy's systematic destruction of Bessent reached its devastating climax. The Treasury Secretary sat frozen in complete shock, his career, reputation, and freedom having been systematically destroyed by the most devastating congressional testimony in American history. As federal marshals moved toward the witness table and prosecutors began drafting criminal charges, social media exploded with Kennedy's complete annihilation of the most corrupt and arrogant Treasury Secretary in American history. The quiet senator from Louisiana had just delivered the most brutal political execution ever witnessed in congressional hearings, proving that Wall Street criminals could not hide behind sophisticated theories when confronted with moral courage and documented evidence of their systematic theft from the American people. The aftermath of Kennedy's nuclear-level destruction of Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent spread through Washington like a political earthquake that registered 10.0 on the corruption scale. Within 30 minutes of the hearing ending, clips of Kennedy systematically obliterating Bessent with documented evidence of criminal fraud were exploding across every platform on Earth. #Bessent Criminal Exposed and #Kennedy Destroys Wall Street shattered all-time trending records, while international financial media described it as the most devastating exposure of government corruption in modern democratic history. In his Georgetown mansion, Bessent sat surrounded by the largest criminal defense team ever assembled for a Treasury Secretary, including white-collar specialists, federal prosecutors, and crisis managers who looked absolutely terrified as they watched their client's career and freedom evaporate in real time. His lead attorney, a veteran of high-profile corruption cases, frantically coordinated with Justice Department officials while monitoring news coverage that legal experts were calling the most clear-cut case of government fraud ever documented on live television. "Scott, this is catastrophic beyond anything we've ever handled," his criminal defense counsel said, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. Kennedy's Treasury documents are being verified by every federal agency, and the $127 million personal enrichment while families lost purchasing power creates an airtight criminal conspiracy case. The FBI is already executing search warrants on your financial records, and federal prosecutors are convening emergency grand juries tonight. Bessent stared at television coverage showing endless replays of Kennedy's righteous fury as he exposed the systematic theft disguised as sophisticated economic policy. The Wall Street golden boy who had spent decades believing he was smarter than everyone else was facing federal prosecution based on his own arrogant testimony and financial disclosure documents that Kennedy had systematically weaponized into criminal evidence. How did that backwoods senator obtain classified Treasury communications calling Americans expendable economic variables? Bessent asked desperately, his Yale-educated arrogance finally cracking under the reality of criminal liability. How do you defend against someone who has every document, every email, every piece of evidence that destroys our entire operation? His communications director, a veteran Wall Street public relations specialist, shifted uncomfortably while monitoring social media metrics that showed Bessent had become the most hated government official in American history. "Sir, Kennedy's investigation was more comprehensive than anything we anticipated. He obtained congressional subpoena power for classified documents and built a criminal case that our legal team says is prosecution ready." Meanwhile, in Baton Rouge, Kennedy was experiencing the greatest constitutional victory in modern American political history. His systematic exposure of Bessent's criminal corruption had united Republicans, Democrats, and independent voters in unprecedented recognition that Wall Street's stranglehold on American economic policy had been broken by moral courage and documented evidence that no amount of sophisticated theory could dispute. Kennedy's office was flooded with calls from FBI whistleblowers, Treasury Department employees, and financial industry insiders providing additional evidence of corruption that extended far beyond Bessent into a systematic network of Wall Street criminals who had been using government positions to steal from American taxpayers for decades. The media response was immediate and universal in praising Kennedy's constitutional service. Conservative outlets celebrated his destruction of Wall Street corruption, while liberal publications acknowledged that his documentation of systematic theft served working families regardless of political party. The New York Times published an unprecedented editorial titled "Senator Kennedy's Constitutional Heroism," while Fox News devoted entire programs to analyzing his systematic destruction of government corruption. International financial markets responded immediately to Kennedy's revelations about systematic fraud in American economic policy. European Central Bank officials announced formal investigations into American Treasury manipulation of global markets, while Asian financial ministers requested emergency consultations about the stability of American economic institutions under criminal management. Corporate America began distancing itself from Bessent and Wall Street economic policies following Kennedy's exposure of systematic fraud. Major corporations that had supported complex financial instruments designed by Treasury officials announced immediate reviews of their relationships with government economic advisors, recognizing that association with documented criminals could damage their brands and expose them to shareholder lawsuits. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and J.P. Morgan Chase announced suspension of all former employee communications with Treasury officials pending federal investigations, while major hedge funds that had profited from Bessent's policies began hiring criminal defense attorneys to prepare for inevitable DOJ prosecutions. Kennedy used his constitutional moment to deliver the most important economic policy speech in decades, addressing the American people directly about the systematic corruption that had been exposed and the fundamental reforms needed to restore honest government. "The American people have witnessed something unprecedented today," Kennedy declared in a primetime address that garnered 67 million viewers across all platforms. "We've seen documented proof that Wall Street criminals infiltrated the highest levels of our government and systematically stole from working families while lecturing us about their intellectual superiority. This ends now. No more sophisticated theft disguised as economic policy. No more Wall Street parasites using government positions to enrich themselves while impoverishing the Americans they swore to serve." Federal grand juries began meeting within hours of Kennedy's hearing testimony. The Justice Department announced that Attorney General Merrick Garland would personally oversee prosecution of the largest government corruption case in American history, while the FBI established a task force to investigate the entire network of Wall Street officials who had used government positions for personal enrichment. House Republicans announced impeachment proceedings against Bessent, while Senate Democrats privately acknowledged that his criminal behavior had created impossible political liability for the Biden administration. Party leaders from both sides praised Kennedy's constitutional service in exposing corruption that threatened the foundation of American democratic governance. The Treasury Department faced complete reorganization as career employees provided testimony about systematic corruption that extended throughout the agency. Whistleblowers revealed that Bessent's personal enrichment scheme involved dozens of senior officials who had designed policies specifically to benefit their former Wall Street employers while devastating ordinary Americans. As Bessent's legal situation deteriorated into inevitable criminal prosecution and imprisonment, Kennedy received recognition from constitutional scholars worldwide who acknowledged that his systematic destruction of Wall Street corruption represented the most important defense of democratic accountability in modern history. Senator Kennedy has performed the most crucial constitutional service in generations by exposing how financial criminals systematically corrupted American economic policy, noted Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig. His documentation of systematic theft while families suffered economic hardship represents exactly the kind of moral courage that democratic survival requires. Kennedy's methodology had established new standards for congressional oversight that prioritized documented evidence over political rhetoric. His systematic approach to exposing corruption through financial records, internal communications, and personal enrichment documentation became the template for investigating government officials who prioritized personal profit over public service. Federal law enforcement agencies implemented Kennedy-inspired protocols for monitoring government officials with Wall Street backgrounds, ensuring that sophisticated financial theories could never again be used to disguise systematic theft from American taxpayers. The quiet revolution in constitutional accountability was complete. Bessent's strategy of using intellectual arrogance and sophisticated complexity to hide criminal corruption lay in ruins, destroyed by Kennedy's systematic presentation of documented evidence that exposed Wall Street's criminal infiltration of American government. As Bessent faced federal indictment and certain imprisonment while Kennedy received universal praise for defending American democracy against financial corruption, the constitutional principle that no American is above the law had been restored through moral courage and systematic documentation of criminal behavior that sophisticated theories could not disguise or justify. Kennedy had proven that Wall Street criminals could not hide behind academic credentials when confronted with federal evidence of their systematic theft from the American people, establishing permanent accountability that would protect working families from future financial predators who viewed government service as criminal opportunity rather than constitutional duty.